So this is the 14th session of the Nāgārjuna Mula Karaka reading group. And today we're going to discuss chapter 21, an analysis of arising and dissolution of existence. I think like usual, it might be good to just read the commentary here. According to all the commentators, the opponent now reverts to the topic of chapter 19, time, insisting that it must be real, since there really occur the arising and dissolution of existence. Since arising and dissolution cannot take place without differences in time, and such differences cannot exist until time exists, the opponent claims time must be ultimately real. What follows is an investigation of the notion that there can be such things as the arising or coming into existence, and a dissolution, or the cessation or disappearance of existing things. Given impermanence, if there are real entities, then there must be arising and dissolution. What the chapter seeks out to determine is what it would mean for entities to exist under conditions of impermanence. As comes out explicitly in verse 14, however, the underlying concern is with what the Buddha meant when he warned against the extreme views of eternalism and annihilationism. Something that does not undergo arising and dissolution is eternal, while anything that does undergo arising and dissolution is, upon its dissolution, annihilated. Abhidharmikas take the Buddha's warning to apply just to partite entities like the person, and use the idea that dharmas undergo arising and dissolution as part of their account of the impermanence of persons. Nāgārjuna will here call that attempt into question. So yes, the big pattern with this chapter is this concern over paving a middle path between eternalism and nihilism, the two extremes that the Buddha taught beyond with these teachings on the middle way. And this is something you can find in the Buddha's very first sermon when he speaks of the middle path between sensual self-indulgence and austere self-denial. So these two extremes come up a lot in his teachings. And in here, we are particularly analyzing the sense of how this relates to existent things, whether or not they're eternalist or annihilationist.
Although in the first sermon, the middle way is the self-mortification versus sensuality middle way.
Mm-hmm.
The eternalism and or the eternalism, nihilism, middle way is in Gacchana Gota Sutta. That's where.
Yeah, I do think there's that difference between sort of a relation with satisfaction on the first pair, and then there's a more sort of ontological or epistemic concern with the second one. But I did point it out because I try to see them as existing in a continuity, that there's a correlation between a kind of eternalistic relation to reality that perhaps can also lend itself towards a sense of indulging in reality, for there is a thing there to indulge into, and then also pairing annihilationism with self-mortification or austere self-denial, to the extent that if you really think that all things are ultimately pass away into annihilation, then there's nothing to really find value or meaning in as a support for your spiritual practice. So it becomes a matter of sort of losing hope in a way, because of the sense that nothing can actually be a basis for spiritual practice. So that's how I try to make a parallel between the two. And then of course, the Buddha's middle path beyond sensual self-indulgence and self-mortification, I think also resonates or is continuous with the middle way beyond eternalism and annihilationism, in the sense that yeah, this middle path in which things are empty and merely dependently originated allows us to work with what is given to us in experience as a basis for spiritual practice, but without being beholden to what these supports are, so that we can continue to exceed in the path. But yeah, but that's a bit of a digression.
Kachana Gota Sutta is actually very interesting. So in the Tanisaro Bhikkhu has an interesting comment on it, which is that it discusses a level of right view lying beyond the Four Noble Truths that has to be applied at the point in the practice where the path has been fully developed and now the path has to be abandoned.
Yes.
And in that one, Gachanagata asks the Buddha, what is right view? To what extent is there right view? And he says, by and large, this world is supported by a polarity, as in like the world of ordinary people, that of existence and non-existence. But when one sees the origination of the world as it has come to be with right discernment, non-existence does not occur to me. When one sees the cessation of the world as it has come to be with right discernment, existence with reference to the world does not occur to one. Everything exists, that is one extreme. Everything doesn't exist, that's a second extreme. Avoiding these two extremes, the Tathagata teaches the Dhamma via the middle, and then he just lists the 12 links of dependent arising via the middle, and then he says the 12 links. And then he says the reversal of the 12 links. And equates that with the middle.
The reversal.
Equates the 12 links with the middle between the two extremes of everything exists and everything doesn't exist. And then says that the reversal is what leads to the cessation of this entire mass of stress. And it's a pretty interesting. It's interesting that Tanisaro Bhikkhu says that it applies at the level where you have to abandon the path. That's an interesting comment on it. That's not said.
Right, that is an interesting comment. I mean
that's not said explicitly in the sutta.
Right.
That there's no reference to abandoning the path. Maybe that's part of the commentary or something. I'm not sure. But
I mean, that makes me wonder then, does that mean on the path you take things to be eternalist or annihilationist?
Well, yeah, definitely on the path you take objects to exist so that you can have karma, and right, like you operate at a level of analysis. This is the thing, like Padmasambhava says, view as wide as the sky, conduct as fine as flower. And Tulku Urgyen Rinpoche glosses this. He has an interesting gloss on this, where he just says, this is like realization versus what you do in the actual practice when you're not realized. So it seems during the path you do maybe even operate, oddly enough, you operate from a level of taking things to exist or taking certain things to not exist. I don't know.
Yeah, I guess my issue is that then how can that ever lead away from non-existence and existence if you're always to start taking it up on the path? It begs the question as to how taking it up on the path also eventually leads you to relinquishing it at the end of the path. There's a kind of discontinuity there that I'm not sure of. And then I'm also thinking like, okay, like what if it's more like a as if, it's like you're taking things as if they existed, so you don't really believe it. But then is that really taking things eternally, eternalistically? You know, it could appear or come in the form almost of taking things to be you know, eternally existent or potential to be annihilated. But if you have that sort of mental qualification that these are mere conventions, it almost seems that that's already in the middle way. It's not really seeing things as eternally. I mean, practically speaking,
I feel like there would still be a difference between that and the sort of, I guess, the ultimate or the final
sure,
which,
yeah.
like Chandrakirti says, is just where nothing appears at all.
Yeah, well, there's not even the as if
Yeah.
part. Yeah.
There's not even
So
the-
yeah. So this as if is like the position of the bodhisattva who is like who is has pretty much eliminated most of the, if not all of the emotional afflictions, but still has that cognitive obscuration to perfect enlightenment that that would make their sort of liminal position obsolete because you don't need that sort of support anymore. Yeah.
Okay. The verses.
Yes, that was a bit of a digression, but I think still important to discuss since that is a pattern that is constantly coming up in this chapter. Yeah, so verse 1. Dissolution does not at all exist either with or without arising. Arising does not at all exist either with or without dissolution. And so this basically is stating the conclusion of the next few verses. And I'll just read the commentary because it's succinct. Dissolution is the going out of existence of an existent entity. Arising is its coming into existence. Each member of the pair occurs either separately or else accompanied by the other. Nāgārjuna claims that none of the four resulting hypotheses hold. The reasons are given in the next four verses. Okay. So verse 2, how could there ever be dissolution without arising? There is no death without prior birth, and likewise, there is no dissolution without origination. And a general point I want to make, which I think anyone listening to this video, and you and I definitely know this, but just in case to cover it, here we are presupposing the Buddhist view of rebirth. So there is a kind of mutual dependence of birth and death that we have to keep in mind, because in this sense, we are accepting that death occurs that before birth, that there is a death, and that that death always gives rise to a new birth. So that's something that we have to sort of keep intact. So we can't pretend that there can be birth without death, because here we're presupposing the Buddhist view.
Isn't this whole chapter is arguing against an Abhidharmika, right?
Yeah, basically. So yeah, so I just had to point that out. So 2. How could there ever be dissolution without arising? There's no death without prior birth, and likewise, there's no dissolution without origination. So, I mean, what I explained kind of just like points to that. So, because we believe in rebirth here, dissolution always gives rise to, dissolution always leads to a rebirth, a new arising. 3, how could there be dissolution together with arising? For death and birth do not take place at the same time. And I think this is pretty self-evident. You can't have two contradictory natures happening at the same time in the same moment. 4, how indeed will they be arising without dissolution? For never is there not found impermanence among existence. So here, what we're saying is that there's nothing without a character of dissolution, because otherwise it would undermine impermanence. And here's another thing that we're also presupposing with the Buddhist hypothetical Abhidharmika interlocutor, which is the Buddhist view or the Buddhist teaching that everything is impermanent. 5, how indeed will there occur arising together with dissolution? For death and birth do not take place at the same time. And this is virtually equivalent to verse 3, where you can have contradictory natures existing and functioning simultaneously in the same moment. Concerning these two things that are not established either as together or separate from one another, how will their establishment ever occur? So this basically concludes from the previous reasonings that And the two things, the arising and dissolution of things, can't be established because they cannot be established as being together or separate. And since these two possibilities exhaust all of their potential ways of existing or being real, once we negate those, we negate their establishment at all. 7. So 7 is a little bit packed. So let's read. There is no arising of what is characterized by destruction, nor is there the arising of what is not characterized by destruction. There is no dissolution of what is characterized by destruction, nor again the dissolution of what is not characterized by destruction. So there's basically 4 points being made here. And just because it's succinct, I'll read the commentary and then maybe we can go a little bit over each reasoning. Chandrakirti explains the argument as follows. Arising and dissolution are events that occur to existing things. And existing things are either characterized by destruction or not characterized by destruction. We may thus ask whether arising and dissolution are to be understood as belonging to an existent that is characterized by destruction or is not characterized by destruction. Something characterized by destruction, however, could not be the locus of arising, since arising and destruction are mutually incompatible. And since there can be no arising of such a thing, there likewise cannot be its dissolution. As for what is not characterized by destruction, there can be no origination of something whose nature it is to never be non-existent. And the dissolution of such a thing is likewise impossible, since it lacks the nature of something that can be both existent and non-existent. So one thing I sort of wanted to go over a little bit is how here in particular, so destruction and dissolution are different here. So destruction, I think we are referring to an action that has taken place. And so destruction is the sort of having ceased of something. Would you agree with that? Because dissolution seems to more so suggest the process of passing away.
Yeah, I think that actually what makes this chapter make a lot more sense is when you put it into the context of the Abhidharmika view of momentariness, under which a thing's being an arising thing and a thing's being a dissolving thing, either you're following the, I think the Sarvastivadin view where there's like 3 parts, or no, maybe that's the Theravada view, where there's like three moments that a thing abides in. Its arising moment, its sustaining moment, and its ceasing moment. But if that's what's happening, well, that seems like you're just talking about 3 different things. One of the nature to arise, one of the nature to abide, one of the nature to cease. And then if each of those has that as its svabhava, well then the first thing, how does it become the second thing? It has the nature of arising, not the nature of ceasing. So how did it become the second thing? The second thing has the nature of abiding. So how did it arise and how did it cease? The third thing has the nature of ceasing. How did it arise? And so on. Or you just imagine it to be in a single moment, a given thing is present, and in the immediate moment preceding it, it was not present, hence it arose, and in the moment immediately succeeding it, it is not present, hence it ceased. But then it seems like it has the conflicting nature. And I think that if you put it into this momentariness context, all of these, how can these things occur either together or apart, seem to make more sense to me. I don't know.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. As different aspects of the process of existence of a given thing. And I think it is important to hit home that, particularly in this this chapter, where we're sort of working with the Abhidharmika view. I mean, the whole text sort of does that, but here there's a bit of a more focus on that, it seems. So I think here in this case, destruction is sort of the completion of the dissolution process to a point of non-existence. So something has been destroyed, and then dissolution is that aspect of a thing which is in the process of ceasing. So the first part is there is no arising of what is characterized by destruction. And the commentary states that this is because destruction cannot be the locus of arising. And I think that's pretty self-explanatory. For something to, for there to be arising, I mean, let me see. I mean, in this case, they're sort of mutually contradictory nature. So it doesn't make sense for one thing which is contrary to another thing to be the source of that of itself. B, nor is there the arising of what is not characterized by destruction. And so for me here, the way I understood this is that arising presupposes destruction. So for there to be an arising, there would have to have been a destruction. So in this case, the destruction of the previous life is presupposed for the arising of the next one. So this is why there is no arising of what is not characterized by destruction. Which is slightly different from what the commentary gives as a reasoning, which is that for what is not characterized by destruction, there can be no origination of something whose nature it is to never be non-existent. So in that case, if there is something that cannot be characterized by destruction, which basically means that it always exists, or in this case, if the life that is not characterized by destruction and never actually passes away, it can't be reborn. There can't be an arising from that. The next point, there is no dissolution of what is characterized by destruction. Here, the commentary says, since there can be no arising of, actually, it's sort of, this sentence actually goes with the previous sentence that goes over the first point. Something characterized by destruction could not be the locus of arising, since arising and destruction are mutually incompatible. And since there is no arising of such a thing, there likewise cannot be its dissolution. Yeah, I'm not sure I get that reasoning in particular, but the way I sort of make sense of this is through that distinction between destruction and dissolution. So dissolution, there is no dissolution of what is characterized by destruction, because something which has already been destroyed doesn't go through a process of being destroyed. It's sort of already completed. It's sort of the termination of the process of dissolution. So it doesn't make sense that that we can say that something which has been destroyed is now going in the process of dissolution. And the last point of this verse, there is not the dissolution of what is not characterized by destruction. And this one is also a little tricky. The commentary states that the dissolution of such a thing is impossible since it lacks the nature of something that can be both existent and non-existent. How do you make sense of this part?
Same thing with the momentariness thing, I think. Like, it can't be both a thing that is of the nature to come into existence in dependence upon whatever preceded it in the preceding moment, and also a thing whose nature is to cease to exist in that very moment. That is, for that moment of its existence to be both the moment of its cessation and the moment of its arising. When the moment of its cessation is a moment of it ceasing to exist, whereas the moment of its arising is a moment of it coming to exist. I think one might respond to this that these aren't actually conflicting properties, because there's a direction to time that's being presupposed here. And so they're not conflicting properties, because the arising is a property that's sort of connecting with the past, that is, to arise means to be existent now, but to not have existed in the past. And whereas ceasing is something that's making reference to the future. To cease is to be existent now, but to not be existent in the future, to be such that it won't exist in the future. But as they say in the beginning commentary, or not in the beginning commentary, the commentary to verse 3, with respect to,
Right.
like, yeah, the opponent, I think that the same point applies here. Recall that the opponent wishes to establish the real existence of time based on the existence of arising and dissolution. To claim, therefore, that arising and dissolution, in this case, that they're occurring at different times. Here we're saying they're occurring at the same time, but are not conflicting properties because they're properties related to different times, one to the past, one to the future. Again, is to presuppose the reality of the past and the future, such that a relation a property has to the past as a second order property can make it different in essence, and thus not contradictory, or like different in essence, just that it's not contradictory with another one because of its relation to the future. The past and future have to already exist for that. So you affirm the consequent, you presuppose what you were trying to, I think.
Yeah, definitely. It seems here either you are circularly presupposing the existence of time, which you're trying to establish, or you're positing the sort of connection between things which cannot be genuinely established, and yeah. So sorry. So still thinking about the particular point in that last part of verse 7, that there isn't a dissolution of what is not characterized by destruction. Oh, I mean, I don't know why I was thinking so much about it. Actually seems pretty simple now. So there's no dissolution of what is not characterized by destruction, because if something is not characterized by destruction, then it's permanent, basically. And so we can't say it goes under dissolution because permanent entities do not go under dissolution. I have this tendency I've noticed sometimes with reading this. Sometimes I think there's a much more complex, deeper point being made sometimes in some of these verses, and I might really scratch my head over it. And sometimes if I go back to it to write my notes, or just like a little bit of insight, it's just like, oh wait, this point is actually pretty simple. I don't know if you get that experience sometimes. And this is kind of like my experience with the Madhyamaka in a way too. It's, early on, it seems like it can seem, and kind of is, a very complex, deep, profound topic with very advanced logical wit that you need to really understand so much of the arguments and keep up. But at the end of the day, the point is actually so simple. And sometimes you can get lost in the complexity and sort of miss the point. And I think that's why it's sometimes, this is why I think this is not a work of philosophy, because philosophy is based on constructing complex points, I think. Whereas here, it's very much pointing to something that's incredibly simple at the end of the day, though of course seems complex because of the clouded minds we have based on our karmic conditioning. But anyway, to continue to the verses. Verse 8, an existent does not occur without arising and dissolution. Arising and dissolution do not occur without an existent. So here is just establishing a point that whenever you're thinking about existence and the arising and dissolution of things, you're always thinking of each of them together. So they're mutually dependent notions or phenomena. So the commentary states, there's a relation of mutual dependence between an existent and its properties of arising and dissolution. Neither can exist without the other. 9. Arising and dissolution do not hold with respect to that which is empty. Arising and dissolution do not hold with respect to which is non-empty. And I think this is pretty clear, actually. So arising and dissolution do not hold with respect to that which is empty, because that which is empty cannot be the basis for truly existing arising and dissolution, because there's nothing there to base arising and dissolution on. Arising and dissolution do not hold with respect to that which is non-empty, because for something to be non-empty, it would have to be inherently existent with an intrinsic nature, and such things are incapable of arising and dissolving, because for a variety of reasons. I think sort of pointing to what you were saying, Sagar, with the momentariness view, holding that these are two aspects of the same unitary process. A non-empty thing cannot bear that quality, because then you have these three different natures within the one nature, and that sort of undermines the intrinsic nature, which is a singular character. So it can't have those properties arising or dissolving.
I actually think this thing about have intrinsic nature being of a singular character is one of the most interesting aspects of this like vein of Buddhist philosophy, because when you really think about things with complex natures, they're all decomposable, because at the point where you're saying this thing is of the nature to be X and of the nature to be Y, then you have to be positing some explanation for why those things are both related in such a way to be connected with the same thing. And now you've created a complex object, the two natures it has, and whatever makes it such that they are had by the same thing, right? So you've introduced either some kind of particular into which the properties in here, or you've introduced it, or you have to somehow show those two natures to actually just be one, and we're mistakenly taking them to be two, but then you've just collapsed down to the one nature thing. So there's all these ways to eliminate complex natures until you get to Svabhava theory. So then if Svabhava theory doesn't work, you're left with nothing. What are you left with? There's nothing left.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and yeah, it seems like whatever things we end up posit as necessarily existing is kind of like, yeah, it can be decomposable as like a scaffold upon like this basic foundation of a kind of singular an assumption of a singular nature that grounds like the whole scaffolding. And it's funny because this fundamental basis is literally that. It's a kind of assumption, and assumptions are like ethereal. There's nothing there. And so once you see that it's an assumption, and it's an unfounded assumption, you let go of it. And another interesting kind of thing there too is that like there's no svabhava, but there's also no non-svabhava, because there's never svabhava for there to be no non-svabhava. And because this is a repeated thing I see in a lot of Buddhist teachers say and texts, is that non-existence is necessarily mutually implicated with existence. So for there to be the genuine non-existence of something, it would have to have existed at some point before. And I think this sort of relates also to the emptiness of emptiness too, in the sense that whatever things that there are to be empty, there are no things there to be empty. But I think I'm digressing again, or going on a tangent again. Okay, 10. It does not hold that arising and dissolution are one. It does not hold that arising and dissolution are distinct. So actually, I've come around to really favoring the one and many argument. I think it can be so succinct and so simple, and I think I don't know, it's a very easy and robust sort of technique, and so I like it whenever it comes up. So I'll read the commentary here actually. The two states must, if they are real, be either identical or distinct. They cannot be identical, since arising conflicts with the nature of dissolution, but neither can they be distinct. For there is invariable concomitance between arising and dissolution. Wherever there is one, the other is also found. And if they were distinct, it would be possible to find an occurrence of one without the other. So one of the reasons why I love the one-to-many argument in how it established emptiness pretty simply and nicely is basically it's like, is X and Y identical or distinct? And if X and Y is identical, then it's like, why are you even talking about two things? If they're distinct, then what's the relationship between the two in the first place? If they're different, and I don't know. I think there's something very nice about how succinct that is of an argument. Verse 11. If you 11. If you maintain that arising and dissolution of existence are indeed seen, arising and dissolution are only seen because of delusion. And so this is just putting forth the Madhyamaka view that to take things as arising and dissolving is to be mistaken about how things are, basically. And that to the extent that you see them at all, there are illusions created within the mind of delusion, within the deluded mind. And so, yeah, so that's like another point that's just going to be elaborated on the further reasonings in subsequent verses. So 12 is another one of these very packed verses. An existent is not produced from an existent, nor is a non-existent produced from an existent. An existent is not produced from a non-existent, nor is a non-existent produced from a non-existent. So a non-existent is not produced from an existent because cause and effect would be simultaneous. And this, I'm not sure if this isn't necessarily a Buddhist view. I think it's just like kind of just makes sense. That here we have to hold that only things which exist in the present can count as existent things. And so that's something to sort of keep in mind here. Colloquially, we might, I mean, even colloquially.
Presentism is a few characteristic of some Buddhist sects, though. Like only the present exists.
But here, in the way it's said in the commentary, it's almost saying that that's sort of what. Actually, wait. So I think that's slightly different. It's like saying the present only exists. I think it's different from saying that existent things must be in the present.
Mm-hmm.
I think which is what's being sort of presupposed here. So
then the first quarter, existent not from existent, is then it already exists, so production's irrelevant.
Right.
Non-existent from an existent doesn't make sense because how could a non-existent be produced?
Right.
Existent from a non-existent doesn't make sense because how could the non-existent be a producer? It doesn't exist.
Right. Nothing doesn't give rise to something.
Yeah, and then non-existent produced non-existent is just two non-existents, so neither of them is either a producer or produced.
Right. It's not saying anything.
So that's actually pretty clear. It's not that complicated, actually.
Yeah.
Weird.
13. Well, 13 is interesting because I think it actually parallels the very first verse of the whole text. Not quite the same, but it has a similar structure. Not from itself, nor from what is other is an existent produced, and neither is it produced from both itself and what is other. From what then is it produced? And I just want to read the very first verse of the book because I just actually like it. It's probably my favorite verse of the whole text. Not from itself, not from another, not from both, nor without cause. Never in any way is there any existing thing that has ever arisen. That's cool. So it just 13 reminded me of that first verse. So yeah, so here are three parts. So not from itself isn't existent produced, because so the text sort of goes here, says that if the nature of a thing to be produced, if it's the nature of a thing to be produced from itself, then because it's its nature, it will always be effective, because that's for what something's nature to be, is for it to constantly effectuate its being. And so this means that it's always giving rise to itself, which has a number of consequences. The one particularly that's pointed out here is a consequence of infinite regress. And the way I understand that, because it wasn't really elaborated here, is if a thing produces itself, it's like, what is that point of mediation between itself and itself? And if you say that it's itself, then you have more points of mediation to keep filling with itself. And it's sort of like, it almost suggests that like it actually, even though you're saying that its nature is to arise, it can't even begin to arise because of this infinite regress problem.
I don't know why it's called this, but this kind of regress of relations, where you have to ask, like, a thing stands in a certain relation to something, but we need to ask what is the relation that allows it to stand in that relation, and then we need to ask that, is called a Bradleyan regress. I don't know who is the Bradley, though.
Is it F.H. Bradley, the idealist?
Maybe, I don't know.
I think it
Could be.
Wait, is it F.H. Bradley? Yeah.
But this is called a Bradleyan regress. Or at least that is what I have. Yeah, Bradley's regress is what it says on SEP, an umbrella term for, articulated by the British idealist F.H. Bradley.
Right, yeah.
Relations were deeply problematic because if you conceive of them as independent from the relata, they need further relations to relate them to the relata. So this argument of a Bradley's regress actually appears in a lot of Indian, like it seems like it was an argument, a set of arguments that was taken very seriously in ancient India and proceeded to continue being taken seriously in medieval India. But it's kind of interesting. Maybe we should be calling it, I don't know, Nāgārjuna's regress.
Right. It's like,
yeah. But I guess maybe there is actually a Sanskrit name for this kind of argument. I don't know.
Maybe we should figure it out and then write an article about why we should change the name to the other thing, and then say that if you don't change the name, you're basically a racist imperialist.
Yeah, because arguments can't have different names in different languages.
Yeah, exactly.
You have to have one name for the argument in every language that refers to the name it had in the first language that anyone ever made it. And so if we discover it that it was made actually in an even older language somewhere, we change the name again. We're always renaming it as we rediscover it for earlier in the past. That would be funny.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like at some point we probably, this is another point too. It's interesting. It's like how much of this reasoning is only possible once you've developed the ability to write.
I don't think this reasoning needs writing. What do you mean?
I mean, maybe not. But
you get in your head and then say it.
I guess. But this not so much. Maybe I'm underestimating the capacity for the mind, especially in those days where you didn't have Instagram and I was about to say MySpace and Facebook, where you can hold so much complex information consistently in your head. I feel like I don't know.
All of the early Buddhist sutras and all of the early part of the Vinaya was translated and transmitted with great fidelity, because different lines of transmission are nearly the same, entirely without writing. Yeah. They didn't write it down. I think people back then just had better memories, were better at doing things without writing. We're a little more dependent on writing than they were. But they were able to do, I think, the same kinds of things.
Yeah, I was erroneously imposing the limitations of my own historical circumstance onto people who are clearly more mentally superior.
Actually, it's something really funny. In Phaedrus, Plato he puts the argument into the mouth of Socrates, of course, but Plato argues that writing is actually bad because he thinks writing as a technology serves to cause a decline in the memory faculties of the people of a culture. The more that they write and rely on writing, which is weird because I'm pretty sure Plato wrote his dialogues. Like, I think the historical consensus is that there wasn't like a period, surely he was giving oral commentary on his own dialogues at the school, but the dialogues themselves, I'm pretty sure the historical consensus is that he wrote them down as he came up with them. He wasn't teaching them entirely from memory. He did make them into books. So it's weird that he then is advancing this argument about this being bad for you. Oh wow, I keep disappearing.
That's fine.
Okay, well, yeah. Anyway.
I don't know much about it at all, but from what I think actually Derrida ends up sort of working with this idea and actually in a way to affirm writing as a kind of like actually, I'm not going to say more than that, but I remember that Derrida has a much more I guess a relatively positive view of writing, but anyway.
I do remember that too.
Yeah,
I only
and I think
read a tiny bit of Derrida, but actually the little bit of Derrida I read was a Derrida essay on this argument in Phaedrus against writing.
Oh, okay,
in defense of writing.
So do you remember what his idea?
No, I don't, because I didn't understand at all.
Yeah. The sense I got maybe would just be like I don't know, there's a kind of embodiment and to writing, the sense in which like this is gonna be a digression, so let's return to the text actually. Let's see. Okay, I think we're at 13. Yes, because we were talking about the Bradley and regress. Okay, so that's the first part of the three parts of the verse. The second part, that an existent is produced from what is other. And so here, so the idea is that for something to be other, they both have to sort of exist for us to be able to compare them. So if there's a relationship of otherness in production, then in a way they both have to exist for us to say that they're other from each other. But at that point, we've undermined the fact that we're looking for production here, because how can there be production with things that already exist? How can X come from Y if they both already exist at the same time for us to say that they're different? And then the last part, which is neither produce both from itself and another. The only reasoning given here is that this is no different from just having the two previous positions at the same time, and since the two previous positions are faulty, you just have two faulty views. Let's see. And I mean, we shouldn't get too caught up in this, but there's a point which I tried to, I think for another case and earlier in the text where this sort of both option was given and then refuted as inheriting the problems of the previous two. I kept thinking that was a little like a cheap argument. It's like not saying anything. But then I tried thinking about how like, okay, if both is a kind of sort of position, like kind of contradictory liminal position where you do have this sort of process of two things sort of happening together, you do kind of end up in a situation where you're actually making both positions at different times in your argument. So you never actually are making a different argument when you posit both. Even when you sort of try to characterize it intentionally as something distinct, you end up just using the two arguments. And I think anyone listening can try to do that demonstration for themselves, but we'll go to the next verse. 14. For one who acknowledges the existent, there would follow either eternalism or annihilationism. For an existent would be either permanent or impermanent. And I think that's pretty straightforward, but I do want to read the commentary only because I think there's a lot of really interesting information here that could be useful. If one holds that they're ultimately real existence, then they must be either permanent or impermanent. So these are the only two options that we have to characterize things. But if they are permanent, then one holds that there are eternal existence. And if they are impermanent, then one holds that there is the annihilation of existence. And the views known as eternalism and annihilationism were said by the Buddha to be extremes to be avoided. And so I think this is the first time we're seeing explicitly the sort of underlying concern of the chapter, which is this middle way beyond eternalism and annihilationism. And because, and this is useful, because your interlocutor, the Abhidharmika interlocutor, actually agrees with you that this is something to avoid, you can actually genuinely use it against them because it's something that they accept. So if you show that other parts of their ideas undermine this thing that they accept, and in a way, a fundamental thing that they want to keep, then it's a very forceful way to refute some of their false views because they have to be consistent with themselves, or risk completely straying from the Buddhist Dharma, which they would not want to do.
So you know what's really interesting? The commentary here says that on the Abhidharma interpretation, and I assume they mean, yeah, on the Abhidharma interpretation, this applies only to persons, but not to dharmas. But some contemporary anti-Abhidharma Theravadins, again, I'm thinking like Thanissaro Bhikkhu, who being from the Thai forest tradition, the Thai forest tradition basically kind of does not care about the Abhidharma. I don't know if they reject it, but they like are not concerned with it. On this issue, rather than just agreeing like, oh yeah, acknowledging existence would involve eternalism, acknowledging non-existence would involve annihilationism because of permanence and impermanence, or instead of taking the Abhidharma view, like, no, this applies only to persons specifically, he seems to have this view that this is just a meditative perception to be cultivated. This is not something to be taken to be like the nature of things, if that makes sense. In other words, he basically seems to view as this is like a particular teaching on a kind of absorption that one attains that is useful for the elimination of kleshas, rather than viewing it as having the implication that samsara isn't real. And recently I listened to a talk between Bhikkhu Analayo and Yonggi Mingyur Rinpoche that was really amazing. It was very beautiful hearing both of them talk and hearing how much they agreed upon and how much like commonality they had between their discussions of meditation, and in particular with respect to emptiness and how is meditated on. Until Bhikkhu Analayo starts talking about this, and then he comes, and then the emptiness serves as a reason to recognize the emptiness of oneself from the klesha, that is, the being empty of the kleshas, to eliminate the kleshas. And I'm thinking, wait a second, no, at that point, you should be recognizing the emptiness of samsara, so you're aware that samsara is not different from nirvana. And I was like, whoa, this is like the Pudgala Nairatma versus Dharma Nairatmya distinction isn't even at the level of meditation or something. It's like a pre-meditation thing, because it sounded like from the way Bhikkhu Analayo was describing that the meditation on emptiness he describes is just like how like Mahamudra, Kagyu meditators, Madhyamikas meditate on emptiness. It was, and Yonggi Mingyur Rinpoche said that as well. But it just was like turned in intention towards the person, not towards samsara as a whole. And I was like, wow, what an interesting difference.
Interesting. So the only real difference is kind of how that awareness is deployed, is what you're saying.
Yeah, that's what it seemed like, yes. which now for this to come up in the commentary too, seems to be precisely the same thing, saying the Abhidharma has the doctrine of emptiness of persons, and then Nāgārjuna is having the doctrine of emptiness of dharmas. So,
yeah. So I actually wanted to read that that paragraph because I think there's a lot of good in there. So like you started.
That's a really good podcast, by the way, with Bhikkhu and Alayo and Yogi Mingyu. It's a wisdom podcast episode. It's great. I highly recommend it. They're both very good, like, and beautiful speakers on meditation too.
I think I remember either you or someone actually posted about that, and I've been meaning to watch it actually.
It wasn't me, but I think I know you're right. Yes, somebody posted on it, maybe even in the Madhyamika study group.
So Abhidharma interpretation of this warning applies only to such existence or beings as persons, and not to what Abhidharma hold to be ultimately real, namely the dharmas. On their understanding, eternalism is a view that the person exists eternally in the form of a self, and annihilationism is a view that the person is annihilated at death, or upon the cessation of the present psychophysical elements. For them, the middle path between the two extreme views is the position that there is a causal series of impermanent dharmas, all of which are empty of the nature of a self. Nāgārjuna claims instead that the middle path involves avoiding the extremes of eternalism and annihilationism with respect not just to persons but to all things. In place of the Abhidharma doctrine of the emptiness of persons, Pudgala Nirātma, he advocates the emptiness of dharmas, Dharma Nirātma, as a true middle path. So I think one of the points that I think you were trying to make with this conversation between someone from the Thai forest tradition and someone from the Tibetan tradition is that you're saying that Bhikkhu Analayo, you said, actually has almost like the same view of emptiness, except it's focused on the person.
Or that was the impression I got. I actually don't want to. I don't want what I thought he said to be thought to be actually, because he, was speaking in a discussion that was not with me. I was a third party listening in on a discussion he was having with somebody else, with another third party as the mediator, Daniel Aitken. So I very well could be misunderstanding what is being said there. That was just the impression that I got, and that might be completely wrong. But it seemed like he had the same understanding of what emptiness is, and it was just applied to like something personal, if that makes sense. Yeah.
I mean, I think this is why it's so important to, I guess, recognize that the important relationship between meditation and post/pre-meditation. That you can't just, and this is the funny thing about people who are just kind of fetishize practice. It's like, oh, just practice and it'll be fine. It's like that sort of presupposes like a kind of distinction, a sort of a non-relation between post-meditation and meditation, where you can sort of do whatever the hell outside of meditation and think that meditation should be fine, but clearly the way we orient ourselves prior to meditation does significantly affect how that meditation is conducted.
I actually think it might be key to even gaining any permanent attainment from any meditative practice. And part of why I think this is mindfulness-based stress reduction, which is, the therapeutic application of mindfulness, actually in many ways as a meditation practice is very, very similar to a lot of the non-dual styles of meditation practice that are actually practiced in Buddhism. Like, it's not, and that are actually practiced in Buddhism, and in Buddhism, in the traditions that practice it, are regarded to be the kinds of things that can bring genuine experience and realization. But the fact that what they use it for is stress reduction, I think genuinely changes the kinds of things that can be produced by that kind of meditation. Even though in practice, what you do during the session looks very, very similar. I think by making it and making the intentions around it, and in the pre-meditation, the intention about stress reduction, you get stress reduction out of it. But if you had a pre-meditation of bodhicitta, that might actually be something that makes something about the meditation different, even if the practical instruction is almost exactly the same, capable of giving the fruits of stress reduction on the one hand, or bodhi on the other hand, potentially. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong, and maybe people in mindfulness-based stress reduction programs are waking up, and I like, who knows, and are becoming bodhisattvas, and are becoming, they're reaching the path of seeing, and I'm just not even aware of it. It could be.
Well, maybe some of them would, if they have the fruitful conditions for it, maybe. But I would agree in the sense that sometimes I wonder, so
this is not, by the way, to dig on mindfulness-based stress reduction. I think that if a meditative tradition from Buddhism can have a purpose aside from bodhi, but that is also beneficial to people, like because it reduces stress, that's very good.
Yeah. I think the issue is that more people need to know that there's this continuum from mindfulness to perfect awakening, and this is very much not being recognized. And I think this is actually my intuition with this is actually because fundamentally bodhicitta is contrary to the structure of present day global capitalist society. So you wouldn't want to put forth that value if you want to maintain any semblance of the structure of how things presently exist. But what I was going to think about what you said is, like, I feel like a lot of times a fixation can be between the relationship between theory on the one side and practice on the other. But I feel like there is this sort of third element, which is what I would say, like the axiological element. It's the value element. So you have theory, you have practice, they're dynamically intertwined, but where do you point it, right? And I think that's the axial motivation. It's the axis around which you actually turn in your process of combining theory and practice. Because in this sense, theory would kind of refer to like the instructions, the sort of an elaboration of the state of the nature of the body and mind to be conducive to these instructions. But I think once you start to point to some of the things that Buddhism points to, which is this motivation to awaken for the benefit of beings, that's a fundamentally axial motivation.
Yeah.
And stress reduction, that's an axial motivation. And the interesting thing is that, like, whereas stress reduction as an axial motivation may be myopic compared to or not far enough compared to bodhicitta. Bodhicitta necessarily includes stress reduction, I think.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, Shantideva has that. How could bodhisattvas be unhappy riding the steed of bodhicitta from joy to joy?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in a way, it's like, why do we need mindfulness-based stress reduction? We can just have mindfulness endowed with bodhicitta. It's like, but
I also think that having the focusing on bodhicitta as the axial motivation may also be an important antidote to, like, I don't exactly know what to call this phenomenon, but I think it's the phenomenon that leads to people who think that because of having certain meditative experiences that they've gained some realization or some lofty spiritual qualities. I think maybe an antidote to this happening to you, into basically tricking yourself into accepting your, like, egoistic spiritual values instead of genuine ones, is just to not be focused actually on experience and realization, and to be focused on bodhicitta. Focus on bodhicitta. If experience and realization come, that's cool. Focus on bodhicitta. Focus on bodhicitta.
And it is definitely, if you really think about it, it definitely is so encompassing that you kind of, you don't need to worry that you're going to skip out on personal realization, because it's come along the way. But
so even put it out of your mind.
Yeah,
don't worry about it. Put it out of your mind. Bodhicitta.
Yeah, exactly. And in a way, to some extent, in a way, bodhicitta kind of ends up being everything. It ends up being the ground, the path, and the fruit, especially when we think about, relative bodhicitta and then absolute bodhicitta. And it seems like pretty much to me, absolute bodhicitta is pretty much synonymous with awakened mind, free from extremes.
But absolute bodhicitta is the fruition of relative bodhicitta too.
Yes,
so
yes,
you solidify relative bodhicitta and it bears its fruit of absolute bodhicitta. There's a really, really beautiful poem that was just written in his journal and then later published when his journals were discovered by Kunu Lama, who was this Himachali Buddhist Lama, 20th century. And one of the verses, it's so beautiful. It's like the sages with immense compassion for beings thought again and again what would be of benefit to them and saw that it was just this bodhicitta. Actually, Malcolm has recommended that poem. He recommended it on the Sangtal forum once because it's published under a book, Vast as the Heavens, Deep as the Sea, verses on bodhicitta. And Malcolm mentioned it once because someone was asking for books on bodhicitta and he said, Vast as the Heavens, Deep as the Sea, Kunu Lama.
Can you actually, when you remember, can you link me to that or just type the text? I definitely want to take it.
Yep.
Random side note, speaking of, I got the box set for Tantra Without Syllables and it is so beautiful.
Oh yeah, it is.
Yeah, I'm very happy to just have it.
I have that, and I also actually have the Rigbarangshar too.
Cool, yeah, I definitely want that. I definitely, so it seems like there's still...
Yeah, it's the Rigbarangshar.
Is Malcolm planning on, I think he may have mentioned it, is he planning on translating all 17 Tantras?
I think he is, yes.
Yeah.
Are you going to receive the loan in March?
Yes, I signed up for that.
Great, me too.
Yeah. I would love to collect all 17 and hopefully actually read them. I am reading it for the class, but anyway, now we're digressing again. So let's see, where are we? Okay, so we've established the main concern with 14.
Yeah.
And okay, now 15. So here we have an objection from the hypothetical interlocutor. For one who acknowledges existence, there would be neither annihilation nor eternity. For a state of being is a series consisting of the arising and passing away of effect and cause. So here, I guess, since we've accused the opponent of falling under the two extremes, the opponent is saying, well, I don't fall under the two extremes because basically
I have a process ontology.
Right, basically. So it's like, so that so-called existence are really a momentary series of the arising and passing away of cause and effect. The response to that in 16 is, if a state of being is a series consisting of the arising and passing away of effect and cause, then annihilation of the cause follows, for there is no re-arising of what passes away. So in this process view, it still doesn't change the fact that if a cause is passing away, it's never going to come back because it's fulfilled its function of being a cause, and it's not going to be present when the effect comes into existence, which says that the cause is truly annihilated. So it still falls under the extreme, the two extremes. 17. 17. There cannot be said to be the non-existence of what exists intrinsically. And at the time of nirvana, there would be annihilation, since the series of states of being ceases. So this is sort of related to a previous point that for something to exist intrinsically, it cannot. So this actually does relate to 2 points I made previously. So non-existence can only hold onto something that has previously existed. That's what it means for something to be non-existent. But for something which is exists intrinsically cannot be non-existent, because it would have to have changed from a state of existence to a state of non-existence, but change is what is denied by an intrinsic nature. And the second part here is curious. At the time of nirvana, there'd be annihilation, since since a series of states of being ceases,
Mhm. This is an interesting point of his.
yeah.
If you really buy the Abhidharma account of why they are not annihilationists, yeah, fine. Maybe you can buy them being non-annihilationists about dharmas, but then they would be annihilationists about arhats. And that's also a kind of annihilationism that the Buddha rejected, like in Givacchagocha Sutta, where he said that you shouldn't reckon parinirvana as annihilation or as birth. You shouldn't reckon it either way. It can't be reckoned as either. So
right, and I think it's something like does the Tathagata exist after death?
does he not exist?
Yeah, right. It's like
Does he
cannot
both-
be applied.
Yeah,
Yeah. Cool.
because it can't be applied to any of these. The Tathagata is subtle, deep, hard to fathom, can't be reckoned in terms of any of the five skandhas. So in other words, what they're doing, they are reckoning the person in terms of the five skandhas, and that's why they're falling into annihilationism. Because, or rather, they're reckoning the, I guess, stream of skandhas, that is the thing that takes up the path and then gains enlightenment, this causal series of psychophysical elements, as something that can truly cease and cease and be annihilated, and that's why they end up annihilationists, according to Nāgārjuna.
Right. Yeah. So that second part of verse 17 is like saying like, okay, like even somehow if we fix the annihilation problem on the path process, at the termination of the path process with the attainment of awakening or arhatship, you do have a cessation happening there. So eventually, at some point, you still have to wrestle with this consequence of annihilationism. If you, verse 18, this is another kind of one of the pact verses. It is not correct to say that the first moment of the new state of being occurs when the last moment of the old state of being has ceased. Nor is it correct to say that the first moment of the new state of being occurs when the last moment of the old state of being has not ceased. So it's basically, is the first moment of birth, so the first moment of birth, does it happen when the last moment of death has ceased, or when the last moment of death has not ceased? So for the first part, actually, I'll read the commentary because it's a little good. So the final moment of one state of being is said to be the cause of the first moment of the new state of being. Does the first moment of the new state of being occur upon the cessation of the last moment of the old state of being, or does it occur before the cessation of the last moment? So when it cannot be upon cessation, since then the last moment will be no more causally efficacious than the last moment in the life of an arhat. So,
and thus birth wouldn't occur, because if the reason why an arhat is not reborn is because the last moment of their, whatever it's the last moment of them ceases without causal efficacy, this also is ceasing without, rather because the arhat enters into cessation and hence there's not causal efficacy. For an ordinary being, if you take the new thing to be on the cessation of the previous thing, then there's also cessation, just like an arhat is ceasing. So why wouldn't they also be not having no causal efficacy, and thus the new birth being produced from nothing, or rather not being produced at all, as though they were an arhat?
Right.
But that is for the Buddhist an absurd conclusion. So
yeah, so whether it's an arhat or an ordinary being, there is still this moment of cessation, and this moments of cessation of passing away do not causally give rise to a moment of rising. Also because I think so they're contrary natures too. So contrary natures can't give rise to each other. The second part is that it can't be prior to cessation, which I think makes pretty good sense. You can't have birth before, you can't have birth before a death, because it's only when the old has ceased that the new can actually have a chance to arrive. And I think, and so 19 is like a little wiggle position. Is so if the first moment of the new state of being were produced when the last moment of the old state were being ceasing, I mean of being were ceased. I misread that. I'll reread that. I'll reread that. If the first moment of the new state of being were produced when the last moment of the old state of being were ceasing, what was ceasing would be one thing, and what was being born would be another thing. So you have, if you have an overlap of birth and death of these two lives, you would basically have two different things, two different persons that's occurring. But what you're really trying to explain is the continuum of death and rebirth for one person.
Yeah.
So this is just adds more complexity than it has to be. 20. It is not correct to suppose that ceasing and being born are simultaneous. Would one be born in just those skandhas in which one died? So there's another situation of trying to have two contrary natures simultaneously. It just doesn't hold. And let's see. Something I was thinking of is kind of diverged a little bit from this particular interlocution with this hypothetical abhidharmika, but just thinking about more generally, let's say you try to say that, like, okay, like when a baby is being born, there is dying happening in the sense that there is the passing away of some of its components to constitute space for a new birth. So you can think about like dying cells and stuff like that. So you can say like, okay, like death and birth existing simultaneously. Mm-hmm. But here you're not actually talking about the same thing anymore. You're just moving to an explanation using different components, and so it doesn't really hold there. We're really talking about the simultaneous ceasing and arising of the same thing, and that is completely contrary, and it doesn't work. 21, the last verse. Thus, in none of the three times can there be a series of states of being. How can it be a series of states of being if it does not exist in the three times? And I'll finish with a commentary. The first part of the verse rejects the possibility that the first moment occurs after the cessation of the last moment. The second part of the verse rejects the possibility that the first moment occurs before the cessation of the last moment. In verses 19 to 20, the third possible time, oh wait, actually I misread that. Sorry. Verse 18 AB rejects the possibility that the first moment occurs after the cessation of the last moment. Verse 18 CD rejects the possibility that the first moment occurs before the cessation of the last moment.
19
before. And 19 to 20, the third possible time, simultaneous cessation and production was considered and rejected. Mm-hmm. Thus, the notion that existence involves a series of causes and effects cannot help the opponent avoid the faults of eternalism and annihilationism. So it seems like even though we went over analyzing and refuting time entirely in chapter 19, the person here was trying to sort of resurrect a sense of truly existing time by referring to the truly existing nature of arising and dissolving, or arising and dissolution. But we've now just established that we cannot use that to establish time or as a causal series without falling into eternalism and annihilationism, without undermining basic Buddhist premises. And something I was thinking about too, sometimes some of these possible views are kind of weird. It's like, who would ever want to hold that ceasing and being are simultaneous, or ceasing and being born are simultaneous? And like, what's the point of that? It sounds ridiculous. But then I thought, like, no matter how ridiculous like a particular position seems, it almost seems like as if, at least if there's one thing that you can ground as inherently existent, you can basically create a whole scaffold on top of that, everything else in the path also being based on that truly existent thing. And so So this is one of the reasons why we're so consistent. Nāgārjuna is so consistent with every possible view that can be put forth to wiggle out of its refutations, because he's trying to be completely exhaustive, because the mind, the deluded mind, is frantic and will use any resource at its disposal to actively construct its samsaric reality. So the next chapter will be fun. Actually, the next 2 chapters are really the meat of the whole text. I think it's some of the most profound topics: the Tathagata, false conception, noble truth, nirvana, the 12-fold chain, the 12 nidanas, and analysis of views. So they all seem to be pretty well spaced. So it seems like we can go through each one with a different session. So next time we'll go over the analysis of the Tathagata.
Yeah, which is also the famous one that brings up the emptiness of emptiness.
Oh, cool. So that'd be great.
Yeah.
Cool.
Or the thing, or rather the verse. It's not the emptiness. The verse about not letting emptiness become a view. Sorry. I think the specific mention of emptiness being empty is actually in Vigraha Vyavartani, which is, like kind of an appendix to Mula Madhyamaka Karaka, not in the Karakas themselves. The Karaka one is don't let emptiness become a view, or the ones for whom emptiness is a view are incurable.
Right. But I feel like there is something like emptiness almost directly asserted in the MMK, if I remember. I don't know if you went over it yet or you come to. It's something like,
maybe I'm not
yada 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 is empty. How can there be anything to be empty? I think I remember something like that.
Oh, maybe, yeah.
Which I think is pretty much emptiness of emptiness. But yeah, but the Vigraha Vyavartani is definitely more explicit with some of these arguments, because I guess that's what the point of that text was, to be more elaborate. Yeah, cool. So next week, hopefully when we meet, we'll go over 22 on the Tathagata. So thanks, and have a good week.
Bye.